In this demonstration, we're going to create a new work item type for the temperature conversion project called a risk. These work items will be used to identify potential risks in the successful and timely completion of the project. The risks can be assigned to team members for analysis and creation of mitigation plans so the project can continue moving forward. The first thing we're going to do is create a new work item type category for the risk work items. Creating a new category allows us to associate a different workflow to risks than we have with more traditional work items, such as defects and tasks. To begin, we'll go to the Types and Attributes section of the configuration data for work items, and we'll create a new type category, which we'll call a risk. Now with that work item type category created, we can go create the risk work item type itself. And we'll select an appropriate icon for those work items. Now we also want to have an attribute associated with our risk work items that we'll call risk level, so we can identify how risky we think this particular risk is. Let's try to create that now. We'll add a new custom attribute that we're going to call risk level. Now notice that we need to choose a type for this particular attribute. Now we could use an existing enumeration that has a high, medium, or low type choice list, such as priority or severity, but we're going to create a new risk level enumeration with precisely the values we want. So let's cancel out of creating this attribute at this time and go first create the enumeration. Before we leave this area, we'll save our project area to capture our new work item type. Click on Enumerations, and we'll add a new enumeration called Risk Level. And we'll create values for that choice list. First one we'll call High Risk, and choose an appropriate icon. We'll add values for medium risk and low risk as well. And we'll select medium as the default. Now that we have the enumeration created, we can go back to our types and attributes and create the custom attribute we need. Let's first make sure we're working in the correct type category and the correct work item type, and now add our custom attribute. And we should be able to choose our newly created risk level as the type enumeration for this attribute. And we'll save our project area as it stands now. So far we have a risk work item type created and a custom attribute created called risk level. Now we want to define what the workflow for these risk items is going to look like. Since many variations of work item types might use the same workflow, RTC allows us to define workflows separately from the work item types. This minimizes the effort required to create separate but identical workflows if we have multiple work item types following the same life cycle. For instance, in the current Scrum process, defects and tasks both use the same default workflow. New workflow, and we'll set its ID to risk. We'll fill out the name, and we'll give it a description. Now we want to get started creating our states and actions that define the workflow. We want our initial state for risks to be called identified. All new risks submitted will be in this identified state. Assigning a risk to a team member transitions the risk from the identified state to the analyzing state. Then, depending on whether or not the risk can be addressed right away, it is either closed or it is escalated to the blocking state for a more in-depth analysis. Let's see how we can design this workflow in RTC. We'll start by creating our states. We'll add our first state called identified. This state represents the first state in the workflow, so we'll choose the open group for this particular identified state. And we'll choose an appropriate icon to represent this state. Next, we'll create our analyzing state. This represents a work item in progress. And again, we'll choose an appropriate icon. We'll create our blocking state. This also represents an in-progress work item. And we'll give it an icon. And finally, we'll define our closed state. And this represents a closed work item. So now that our states are defined, we can begin defining the actions that take us from one state to the next. We'll begin by defining a start action that puts the work item into our initial identified state. That action will be called open, and the target state is identified. And we'll choose an appropriate icon. Now we can begin adding states by simply filling in the correct cells in the state transition matrix. So to go from our identified state to our analyzing state, that will be the assign action. So we'll create that now. To go from the analyzing state to the blocking state, we decided that would be escalate. To go from the analyzing state to the closed state will be a close action. So that defines our basic workflow. A new risk is created in the identified state. It gets assigned to a team member, which moves it to the analyzing state. From the analyzing state, we can escalate the risk, moving it into the blocking state, or we can close it. Let's also define a couple of actions that allow us to cycle through the workflow. For instance, if we have a blocking defect that we want to assign to somebody else to go be reanalyzed, we can go from blocking back to the analyzing state, and we'll use an action called revisit. If a previously closed risk item needs to be reevaluated, we also want to be able to go from the closed state back to the analyzing state, and we'll give that an action called reopen. So we already have our start action defined. Our resolve action is close, because that's what indicates that the risk has been completely mitigated. And our reopen action, to take us from that closed state back to an active state was reopen.